Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the NARM Training Institute. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Hi, Transforming Trauma listeners. If you're a licensed mental health professional working with complex trauma and are interested in learning the neuroaffective relational model, we're excited to share with you about our upcoming NARM therapist trainings. The Level 2 NARM therapist training is a clinical training designed for licensed mental health professionals, current mental health graduate students, and active clinical interns and trainees, where you will get trained in a comprehensive developmental framework and clinical approach for resolving the long-term impacts of ACEs and CPTSD. As you are learning and integrating NARM, you will receive individualized support from a team of skilled, passionate, and supportive trainers led by NARM senior faculty Brad Kammer. If you're interested in learning to support the healing of complex trauma, we encourage you to register now to reserve your spot. For more information and to register, please visit www.narmtraining.com/schedule. And now for our interview. Dr. Jonathan Shedler is a psychologist known internationally as an author, consultant, researcher, and clinical educator. Dr. Shedler's research and writings are shaping contemporary views of personality styles and their treatment. He is author of over 100 scientific and scholarly articles, creator of the Shedler-Westin assessment procedure for personality diagnosis and clinical case formulation, and co-author of the Psychodynamic Diagnostic Manual. He has more than 25 years' experience teaching and supervising psychologists, psychiatrists, and psychoanalysts. Please enjoy this conversation with Dr. Jonathan Shedler. All right, I'm sitting here with Dr. Jonathan Shedler. Welcome to Transforming Trauma.
Hi.
Hi. We're so happy to have you here.
Good to be here.
Yeah. So as we always start, I'll just ask you, what is it that you would like listeners to get out of our time together today?
I'd like listeners to get a better idea of what good therapy really is, because there's a lot of bad information out there.
All right. That's a perfect place to start. Well, if you could tell us a little bit about, yourself and how you came to the field of psychotherapy.
Wow. Let's start with something small and bite-sized.
Yeah.
I have an unusual background as a psychologist. The field of psychology is very bifurcated. It's very compartmentalized. There are research psychologists who become academics and go into academic careers. There are clinical practitioners who become psychotherapists. And we call them both psychologists, but they're actually entirely different fields. They're different trades. It's not the case that people start with a common background and branch off into different directions. That decision is really made up front at the very beginning. Most people involved in research have never seen a patient in their lives. People who are involved, who are trained to be psychotherapists, have very little connection to the world of research. So there's a big chasm between science and evidence on the one hand and practice on the other. And when I said there's bad information out there about psychotherapy at the beginning, a lot of the information we're getting comes from researchers who, by and large, are asking and answering research questions that are very disconnected from the realities of clinical practice. And their advice, their recommendations have kind of been enshrined in clinical practice guidelines by professional organizations. And from my point of view, a lot of it is very unrealistic advice. I'm one of very few people. I'm a longtime published researcher. I'm best known for my work in personality patterns and personality styles and their role in psychotherapy, and for my work in psychotherapy outcome research, specifically demonstrating the benefits of psychodynamic therapy, and we can talk a little about what that means, and kind of exposing the emperor's new clothes around what's being promoted in the field as evidence-based therapies. Talk about that too, if it's So I'm one of relatively few people who, I am a therapist. I treat patients regularly. I teach trainees in psychotherapy, psychologists, psychiatrists, other forms of therapists. I do it, other kinds of therapists. I do it every day. I'm one of relatively few people in the profession who really can translate fluidly between the world of research and the separate worlds of research and the worlds of clinical practice.
Yeah, and I appreciate that you're recognizing there's some really different things going on with those two approaches. I'm curious what led you, maybe from a personal standpoint, to the field.
Yeah. Well, I didn't start out planning to be a psychologist. I was actually an economics major. I was incredibly naive growing up. I grew up reading books about psychology, pop psychology books, when I was like 9 years old. I was just like devouring everything about psychology that I could find. What I didn't understand, what I was reading wasn't what you get in psychology departments in universities. I was actually reading about psychoanalytic or psychodynamic ideas and treatment, which was the prevailing form of treatment at the time. So I managed to get through college since I wasn't a psychology major, kind of unaware of that distinction. After my undergraduate degree, I spent another year making up, essentially the undergraduate equivalent of a psychology degree, so I could apply to graduate school. And that was when it began to dawn on me. It's like, wait a minute, this isn't what I thought I was getting. It was really a kind of a rude awakening. And that tension between what I thought was psychology, and I think most people actually think of psychology, who we are, how do we live a life meaningfully, what gets in our way, what are the ways that we psychologically trip over our own feet, what are the challenges in trying to connect with one another in the world, or failing to connect with one another? How can we know ourselves more fully and deeply? Right? These are the questions that I thought psychology was about. And I think most people think psychology is about. And, I can tell you, if you go to a psychology department in a major university, you will get nothing, literally nothing, that has to do with any of those questions. I was interested in, the ways that we don't fully know ourselves and how we can come to know ourselves, better. I was interested in dreams. I was interested in how we, reveal things about ourselves in, indirect or symbolic ways, right? This is actually the bread and butter of what I would call meaningful psychotherapy. But I had to take a long, 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 long detour through the world of research psychology to eventually find my way back to where I thought I was going.
Yeah. Yeah. What you're really interested in the first place, kind of where the rubber meets the road, it sounds like.
Well, yeah, I think it is.
Yeah.
And when people come to psychotherapy because they want help, people don't come to therapy because there's some, logical, straightforward solution. Like, oh, well, you've been doing this and all you need to do is, that. Instead, there's your answer. Here, I'll take the fee for your session, go home, and all is well. It doesn't work that way. That we're, humans are infinitely complex. We're not of one mind about things. We're of two minds or three minds or many minds about pretty much everything that's important. There's no unitary, single self, right? We have many selves, many parts of self. They're often in contradiction. They're often working at cross purposes with one another. The very first thing a trainee in psychotherapy discovers if they're trying to do real psychotherapy, and by real psychotherapy, I mean therapy aimed at changing something fundamental about who we are so that we can live our lives differently and, hopefully in a more satisfying way. The first thing we find out is, the person comes with difficulties, and they come because they want to change, or we should say a part of them wants to change. And as soon as we try to help them change, we find out that it's not so easy. There are other parts of the person that we don't initially hear from in words that have very different ideas and don't want to change. And we immediately find ourselves in the midst of the person's contradictions. And that's where real therapy begins.
I appreciate, I think I mentioned before we press record how much I appreciate the work you're doing. And one thing that I've really enjoyed is I've read your journal articles and, followed you online, is your way of really cutting through so much of what feels like academic language.
I try.
And just spelling out what really lands for me, as a psychotherapist, as deep truth. And I wonder if you could speak to that piece that you said, like, it's not working. Like when a client or a patient comes in, what is it that's getting in the way? What isn't working for them? And how do you hold that?
Well, however painfully a person is living their lives and functioning, however much they are getting in their own way or, creating obstacles to living in a more satisfying way, being human, we could say we work to maintain homeostasis. Maybe that's a fancy big word for saying that there's a way that the devil we know is better than the devil we don't know. And however miserable we might be, there is something in us that desperately holds on to the status quo. Not all, that's an overstatement, but most of the difficulties that bring people to psychotherapy were once solutions. They served a purpose. They're not there by accident. They didn't come out of the blue, right? The way that a person functions in the world is largely an adaptation to their earliest world, which is to say their family and their parents. Right? It solved various problems in that world. And generally, however costly those solutions turn out to be in the long run, right? They were the best solutions available to typically a small child at that time. So, the issue isn't this way of doing things, this symptom, these life patterns are good or bad. The issue is that they once served a purpose, probably a necessary purpose. They've long since outlived their solution. They are now, very costly and a source of pain. But the person's concept of themselves and others in the world was formed at a much earlier time developmentally in their lives, right? And those patterns, those ways of being endure. Right? They tend to be stable. They become crystallized. They become our way of functioning. And somebody can come in from the outside and say, well, don't you see you're doing this, this, and this, and look at the terrible consequences. Wouldn't you want to do it differently? Yes. Here, we'll do this instead. Not so simple. Mm-mm. Because doing this instead at an earlier time in the person's development, it may well have had terrifying consequences. And that part of the personality or that part of the person's psychology still remains and still endures. So when we talk about psychological change, we have to reckon with that part. We can't deal just in the realm of what's logical and rational, that just scratching the surface of the problem. It cannot lead to deep and meaningful change. So really that's where therapy starts. What's going on right now in the therapy world is we have a lot of academics pushing, very brief and what I would describe as very superficial therapies. Because they're brief and superficial, they're also cheap, which means health insurance companies jump on the bandwagon and public policy makers jump on the bandwagon. So we're getting a lot of voices out there telling people that very brief, relatively superficial treatments are evidence-based, are the gold standard of care. That's the term people use, gold standard. And if you Google just about any mental health problem under the sun, you're going to very quickly find information telling you that some brief therapy is the proven gold standard for your difficulty. The word evidence-based, as it's used in the profession, pragmatically, is really a code word. It almost always refers to very brief treatments, almost always versions of CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy. And specifically, it's a code word for treatments that are standardized and literally conducted by following an instruction manual. So you get a diagnosis. The diagnosis, a DSM diagnosis, is now defined as the problem, which is a spectacularly unpsychological way of thinking about, about human psychology. The idea, the outcome, the desired outcome is now reduced, collapsed to changing your score on a questionnaire that measures symptoms specific to that diagnosis. It's like we all collectively, starting with researchers, put on blinders. Nothing else matters. In fact, it doesn't even matter whether any benefits that we see in the short run last. We don't really study that either in research studies. Right? And so the whole thing is kind of a house of cards that most people who get these therapies, in fact, don't get well and don't stay well. The benefits, it's a very small percentage of people who seem to get lasting benefits from these treatments. The lion's share of people who get these treatments are dissatisfied with them. And yet, we've got thought leaders and major stakeholders beating the drum constantly, telling people this is the right treatment. And people get steered to treatments that are very inadequate. And then one of two things happens, and those two things are both terrible. One, the person doesn't benefit. And one is they think the problem is them. They're so bad, they're so broken, they're so defective that they're beyond the reach of treatment. That's usually not true. We can help most people. What's true is the treatment that they got was inadequate. Or instead of deciding I'm so bad, they decide that, therapy is unhelpful. So people get these very brief, typically 8-session instruction manual assembly line treatments. They really don't get helped. And they don't come out and say, manualized, standardized, uniform assembly line brief treatments aren't helpful.
Yeah.
They come out and they say psychotherapy isn't helpful. And we've now shut the door to offering help to people who, in fact, are very likely to have benefited had they gotten what I would call a more meaningful treatment.
Yeah. I've been thinking about and having conversations lately about when help isn't helpful and how folks will walk into my office and they've had a lot of CBT or they've had a lot of this or that. And just like you said, they feel broken and really hopeless about what therapy can potentially offer. And, oftentimes they'll name later how glad they are they tried it again. But I wonder what the numbers are.
And people they don't know how to find meaningful therapy. They don't know what to call it. They don't know what it looks like, right? They don't know. I mean, people are just, out there, sort of operating blind, listening to the advice they get from what seem to be reputable and credible sources, and I mean, they have no idea how to even find what they need. And I mean, really, it's heartbreaking to me. I only have so many hours in the week that I can devote to treating patients. And I mean, there are so many people who contact me. It's not like I have a crystal ball. I'm going to say, I know I could help them, not with certainty, but I'm pretty damn sure. And I can't see them. I don't even know where to send them. Everybody I know, every other therapist I know who's well-established, qualified, good at the work, is likewise full. Most well-established therapists don't want to be part of a health insurance system because health insurance companies often make it impossible to provide good care. Right? So there's a kind of a moral injury in it for the therapist. It's like, I know what good care is. I know what I'm capable of providing. I know what this patient needs and could benefit from. And then I'm working with an insurance company that repeatedly ties my hands as a clinician and says, you can't do the work that you know how to do. Well, that's a terrible situation for therapist and patient both. So, I mean, we really have a crisis in the country. It's not about, people think the crisis is about, access to therapy. Actually, we have a glut of therapists in the field. It's access to good, meaningful, serious psychotherapy. And that takes time. By the time somebody gets to a psychotherapist, it's not like they woke up on, Monday feeling depressed and they, go to a therapist on Tuesday. I mean, by the time that somebody comes to a psychotherapist, they've struggled with their problems for quite some time. In very important ways, those problems are really woven into the fabric of who they are and in their lives. It took years or decades or a lifetime to get to that point. And, we don't work magic. Difficulties that are ingrained and have taken a lifetime to develop are flat out not going to just go away in a matter of weeks. It takes time. And there's a lot of people out there putting out the message, 8 weeks, gold standard, 12 weeks, proven results. They're selling snake oil. And what's worse is they're selling snake oil in the name of science. Like I said, the science, if you really dig into it, is kind of a house of cards. But it's a very difficult situation for people who are trying to provide meaningful psychotherapy, because as soon as you say, well, that's actually not good therapy, the immediate response is, well, you're anti-science. You're not practicing in an evidence-based way. But the problem is that the word evidence-based has become a kind of a marketing buzzword. It no longer means what people think it means.
Wow. You named this piece about the brief, like people are selling 8 sessions, 12 sessions. And one thing that I learned, in the beginning of my training, really, especially with NARM, is how important it is to slow it down.
Yes.
And that goes against this piece of like, oh, we're done in 8 weeks. So when a client's like, why are we moving so slow? I'm like, we got to slow down because otherwise we miss all the important stuff. I don't want to miss the important stuff. We've got to slow it down. So I really know.
Well, let me unpack what you said a little bit, right? So we acquire certain patterns, certain ways of being. including and especially ways of being in relation to other people. We internalize these patterns very early in our lives, for better or worse. We live them out, we repeat them for the rest of our lives, and they happen very automatically, right? They're not a product of thought or decision making anymore. They are natural, automatic, habitual responses, right? They happen quickly. If you want to look at it through a psychoanalytic lens, you could say that the things that are driving these patterns are largely unconscious. If you want to look at it through the lens of experimental cognitive psychology, like Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman wrote a popular book about his work. It's called Thinking Fast and Slow. He talks about two systems of thinking or processing information and making decisions about the world. One operates very quickly and automatically and outside of conscious attention. The other, operates more slowly and carefully and is consciously monitored. You can look at it through a psychoanalytic lens. You can look at it through a neuroscience lens. You can look at it through an experimental psychology lens. No matter how you look at it, crucially important things that we do, patterns that we live out, happen automatically, relatively unthinkingly. Another way to say it is, it's like water to a fish. If it's been there from the very beginning and you've never experienced not water, you really couldn't even have a concept of water. There's nothing, right? There's nothing to compare it to or contrast. Right. Everything. So what we do in psychotherapy, in meaningful psychotherapy, is we very intentionally slow things down. So right, things happen. We automatically go from point A to point B. It's a foregone conclusion. There's no decision involved, right? There's point A, point B. And that's how we experience it. Oh, of course, this is our natural response. Like what else would you expect? Well, no. Let's actually slow down and take a look at that. What we want to do is slow things down enough so that we can start to notice the things that happen internally between point A and point B. So when I say the things that happen internally, I mean thoughts, feelings, memories, images, sensations, physical responses. There's a world of things that happen between point A and point B that we don't normally notice. If we can insert spaces for attention and reflection, right, in those gaps between A and B that we don't even recognize are gaps, right, that opens the door to freeing ourselves from the self-defeating patterns that we're living out, right? It opens the door to not having to keep doing things the same, painful and self-defeating way. So the goal of this kind of therapy really is freedom, freedom from the constraints of old, ingrained, automatic patterns, right? The goal of this work is to be able to live our lives more freely, to create options and choices where they previously didn't exist. We started playing with that idea. It drives me crazy. There's all these tech startups, and they're all offering, some kind of tool or app or something. They all want to speed up therapy, accelerate it, optimize it, efficiency. Yeah. Some of them even use like car metaphors. There was one, we're going to turbocharge your therapy, and so you can do it 100 times faster. I don't even know what that means. I don't think they do either. Or the idea, you're like, no, you don't understand a goddamn thing about psychotherapy. The goal is not to optimize anything. That is not the cure. That is the disease. You're doing things so quickly, right, that you don't realize the choices and options in your life that you've been blind to. The goal is to slow things down and create freedom. So these tech companies that are talking about optimizing therapy and accelerating therapy and turbocharging therapy, I don't know what they're talking about, but they're sure as hell not talking about psychotherapy as I understand it. And, I would say, as other, legitimate, serious, well-trained psychotherapists understand it.
Oh my gosh, thank you for naming that. That isn't the cure. Speeding it up is not the cure. That is the disease. A line in one of your posts was that a good therapy relationship is more than warm feelings.
Yes.
And I've also heard you say that our patients recreate their problematic relationship patterns with us in the therapy relationship.
Yes.
And that our unavoidable participation in these patterns provides the crucial window into their inner world. Can you speak more about that? That's so vital.
So, I'll unpack that. A very, very central concept in psychotherapy, and this is all forms of psychotherapy. Everybody recognizes this. It's not unique to one or another brand or model of psychotherapy. It's universal. Is the working alliance, or what many call the therapeutic alliance, is absolutely central. The single most important determinant of the outcome of therapy is the quality of that working alliance. The problem is we have a lot of not very well-trained therapists out there who don't actually know what a working alliance means. And what they think it means, right? The common sense view is, it means we connect, we get along, we like each other, we feel good about each other. And that's really not quite it. So a working alliance is an alliance around the work that we're here to do, the purpose of the work. It's not like we feel connected with each other because we both like to go sports, fishing, or we like Taylor Swift concerts. It's an alliance around a shared understanding of what it is that we're trying to accomplish together. So the actual meaning of working alliance, it has three pillars. One is that there's mutual connection. That is, both parties feel connected enough that they want to continue meeting. They are both mutually invested enough in this relationship that they want it to go on. Right? So there's connection or attachment. That's one pillar. The second is mutual agreement about the purpose of the work. And I'll add that the purpose of the work has to be psychological change, to change something about the person that they desire to change about themselves. If the goal isn't to change something about ourselves, then whatever problem we're having, it may be a serious problem, but it's not a psychotherapy problem. The third pillar is a mutual understanding and agreement about the methods that we're going to use in the service of achieving this purpose. So that's what a working alliance means. And if you're a therapist listening to this, think about it through this lens. If you're a patient or a client or a prospective client, also think about it. It's not about, do you like the person? Do you feel good with them? Do you feel that they can understand you? Do you feel comfortable talking to them? All of that is important, but it's not enough. Have you and they together, reached an understanding about what's leading to your difficulties? What's making you vulnerable to your suffering in whatever ways you're suffering, right? That both of you recognize as meaningful and important, something that you desire to change, something that you think would make your life better if you were able to change it. Right? Is that on the table? Has it been said in words, discussed, explored, understood the same way, mutually shared and agreed? Third is the methods. What are we going to do? And that's another topic. So now let's shift to your second question. By virtue of being human, this is just how we're constructed. We acquire certain patterns, how we function in the world, and how we relate to other people, and we live out these patterns. This is not about health or sickness. This is not about a diagnosis. This is not pathology. This is how we are constructed. This is what it means to be human. We live in a world of patterns, and we create patterns, for better or worse. Right? I mean, if the patterns that we live out are patterns that allow for connection, fulfillment, engagement, joy, then all is well. If they're causing suffering or limitation, well, then all is not well. But either way, we're living out certain kinds of patterns, especially relationship patterns. Right? We see ourselves and we see other people through the lenses of our early formative relationships. And we recreate the patterns of those early relationships one way or another. Right? So we bring our patterns with us wherever we go. Now, here's the important part. Psychotherapy is also a relationship. And when a person comes into psychotherapy, they bring their relationship patterns with them, necessarily and unavoidably. Right? And the therapist, we could say, will be drawn into the gravitational pull of that person's patterns. We find ourselves being a certain way with this person that's different from how we are with that person. We find ourselves reliving and reenacting certain life patterns with them. Right? The patient brings their lenses for how they see other people into the therapy relationship. They apply those lenses to make sense of this new person and this new relationship, and they behave accordingly. Right? We have a word for that. That's what we call transference. Transference is bringing those lenses and those patterns with us. The ways we've experienced other relationships in some important way gets transferred into this new relationship. Right? And this is the most important thing that happens in therapy. Most of the difficulties, I want to say most, because there's always exceptions, but most of the difficulties that bring people to treatment are embedded in their patterns of relating and attaching to other people, or failing to relate and attach to other people. And they bring these patterns into the therapy. And if we do it properly, we arrange the therapy situation in such a way that we can see those patterns in high relief, right? We're not just talking about them in the abstract. It's not an academic exercise. We are both experiencing them, living them together in the here and now, right? And this is where they can be noticed, recognized, described in words, and hopefully reworked in a way that can allow the person to function in a way that's more satisfying, right? In a way that can help free them from repeating these patterns. So at the heart of psychodynamic or psychoanalytic therapies, which is to say traditional talk therapy, is the idea that the therapy relationship itself becomes a window into what goes wrong and what goes right in the person's other relationships, right? And a place where those patterns can be understood and reworked. And that is the essence, that is the heart of psychodynamic or psychoanalytic therapy approaches. Right? We don't have to talk about what the patient is doing with somebody else somewhere else. We're living it with them here and now in one way or another. And that is necessarily true. That is the essence of the work. Let me say it in a more pithy way. We count on the patient to up the therapy relationship in the same kind of ways that they up their other relationships. And that's what makes it possible to help them rework that. That's the essence of it.
And that's cutting through the academic language right there.
Well, I try.
That's why we wanted you on here. Yeah, you've named, oh my gosh, that's so rich, because you've named some just really important pieces. And you actually led right into my next question so you talked about the client transference. And then, what do we do with that as therapists when something comes up, our own countertransference, or they up the relationship or like whatever? What do we do with that? Because, I know in a lot of trainings, countertransference is really held in this negative light. And I've heard you talk about it in a different way.
Radical, bizarre misunderstanding of countertransference is not something we can get rid of, nor would it ever be desirable to get rid of, ever.
Yeah.
That just makes my blood boil.
That would make us robots.
I mean, it's uninformed and ignorant beyond belief. We are humans also, and it cannot and should not be otherwise. And countertransference really, has two broad meanings. One is we, not being human beings ourselves, we necessarily bring our own psychology and our own patterns into the treatment relationship. Hopefully, we've done our own work in our own in-depth personal psychotherapy or psychoanalysis, and in our own clinical supervision for those who aren't in the field. Supervision is how therapists, it's how training occurs. Right? It doesn't mean supervising like a boss. It means the trainee meets with their patients or clients, then they meet with their clinical teacher, clinical supervisor for an hour and discuss what's going on, right, in their work with the patients, right? So it's kind of an apprentice model. We do our work in our own therapy and in our own supervision. Hopefully we gain enough awareness of our own patterns and blind spots and things that we tend to, our own lenses, to, not allow them to start running the show in therapy. But that's one meaning of countertransference. But the other meaning, the more relevant one for our purposes, is the patient responds to us in certain ways. They treat us in certain ways, right? And this stirs up feelings in us. It pulls for things in us. It pulls and pushes us into various roles, right? So countertransference, if transference is the patient's emotional responses to us, the therapist, and the lens through which they view us. Countertransference is our emotional responses to that, to what the patient evokes in us. That is crucially important information. That is the most important information a therapist has to work with. And the last thing we want to do is try to shut that out. So, oh, that's bad. I only have warm, fuzzy, nicey poo feelings toward my patients. No, we have the full spectrum of human feelings toward our patients. And it's information. So, imagine hypothetically a somewhat narcissistically organized patient. And they come into treatment. Nobody ever comes to, hardly ever, people come to therapy and say, I'm here because I'm narcissistic. That's not right. People come because they're depressed or they're anxious or their relationships have blown up in their face, right? But we start to interact with the patient, right? So, what we know is things are going wrong in this person's life that they want help with. What we're focused on is, in what ways are they inadvertently contributing? What's their role in it? How are they creating or perpetuating their difficulties in ways they don't have to do? I mean, that's what we're focused on understanding. We find out, well, the person has an important position. They are around people a lot. They, get a certain amount of attention. And nevertheless, there's a way they feel sort of alienated and isolated, even in the presence of others. They feel disconnected from people. Well, yes, they are going to be depressed. That is a recipe for feeling depression. And we notice something starts to happen in the therapy. We notice we ourselves are starting to feel disengaged or bored or disconnected from the person. We find our attention drifting. And if we are well trained and good at the work, we notice that. Right? We notice something that we are thinking, feeling, doing that's a little different from what's characteristic for us. And then we say, why? What is going on? Is this information about something about me? Something in my life? No, this is really happening with this particular patient. Is this information about something about them and what they're doing in the relationship with us? And then we start to notice some things that hadn't come into clear focus before because we weren't looking for them. We notice that the patient is not really engaging with us as, another human being. They're treating us as a sounding board. We're in the role not of a participant in a mutual discussion. We're in the role of audience. We say things, we make comments with the intention of offering something that's helpful. We notice, the patient doesn't agree and take up the topic or disagree and take up the topic. There's a way the patient just kind of brushes it off and moves on to the next thing that interests them, right? So, as if we barely even exist. There's an experience that I gave it a name. I call it, comes from Star Trek, the original Star Trek. I call it the beam me up Scotty experience. And if you don't know the original Star Treks, right? So they would have this thing called a teletransporter or which
teleporter, I think.
Whatever. Yeah. Anyway,
years.
they're up there on the Starship Enterprise and they send this beam down to the planet and the person just dematerializes and disappears and they beam them back up to the spaceship. Or they're gone from the planet. Now they're up in the spaceship and they can beam someone else down to the planet and put somebody else there. And the beam me up Scotty experience is it's a feeling before it's words. But the feeling is if Scotty up on the Starship Enterprise, beamed me up from my therapist chair and beamed somebody else down and put somebody else in my place, I'm not sure the patient would even notice.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now I have a crucial piece of information. One of the reasons the person is depressed, one of the reasons they came to therapy is because there's a way they feel disconnected and alienated. Well, now I have direct firsthand data about what goes on in their relationships that necessarily leads to alienation and disconnection, right? That makes other people not really want to engage with them, that makes the person inaccessible in important ways to really being connected with. The work of therapy is right. Then I want to take that information that really arises in the countertransference, and I want to make use of it constructively. Now I start, now I start bringing it up in the therapy sessions, right? I start bringing it into the sessions as something to notice and think about together. So I'll make a comment and the patient goes on to whatever their next topic is without really acknowledging my comment. Well, I'll say, I just noticed something, something just happened just here. I said thus and so, and, I notice you're now talking about something else, like, I don't know, like my comment didn't seem relevant to you or didn't interest you. I'm curious about your side of that experience. That's what I observed and experienced. Help me understand what was going on with you at that moment. So we start to bring it into the therapy session. So patients communicate on 3 channels simultaneously, and we have to monitor and use all 3 channels. One is the content of the words they speak, what they tell us directly. It's first channel. Second channel is their nonverbal communication, right? What they're communicating to us, not verbally. The third is the countertransference that they evoke in us. Generally, the third one, the countertransference channel, is the most important channel, and it's the one that most therapists who are trained today are least likely to learn about or understand. You understand my reaction now. In that context, when somebody says countertransference is bad, you should get beyond the countertransference. Mm-hmm. Because what I hear is you don't understand the basics of what a psychotherapy relationship is and how it works. You don't understand the concept that the person brings their relationship patterns into the therapy and recreates them in the therapy relationship. And that is the most important information we work with. If you don't understand that, you don't understand the process of psychotherapy. Then all you've got is, tools and, exercises and homework assignments and worksheets and all of these things. While they have a place, but all of these things are peripheral. They take the focus off of the most important thing that's going on.
Yeah. And for me, what's really landing and feeling alive in me as you're talking about is just how important the relationship is. That's the whole point. That's where the gold is, really. And that's how we hold it in NARM too, is that relational aspect, that
the third channel.
Third channel.
Here's something that comes up all the time with my supervisees, trainees. I mean, most of the people who go into this field work hard, are well-intentioned, want to help people, right? And, they care about their clients or their patients. Most. Certainly the ones that I teach and supervise do. And it's very, very common. You get a particular client or patient and they don't seem to be benefiting. And the therapist starts feeling like nothing they do seems to be helping. The therapist starts to feel hopeless and helpless and despondent. And depending on the therapist's personal psychology, they might start, berating themselves. I'm not good enough. I don't understand enough. I don't have the skills. I mean, that's a pretty common response. But a more helpful response is, do I feel this way across the board in my work with everyone? No, there's something about this patient. What is it? What's going on? What's being enacted or recreated between the two of us? There's 2 broad categories of transference. There's what we call complementary countertransference and concordant countertransference. Complementary countertransference is that we take on a set of feelings. We find ourselves taking on a role that's complementary to what the patient is feeling. So the patient is feeling, needy and wanting to be cared for, and we find ourselves, stepping into a caretaking role and wanting to take care of them, right? The complement to their experience. The other kind of transference is concordant countertransference, where we start to feel something very much like what they feel. Well, now the therapist is feeling helpless, hopeless. Nothing that I do is working. I don't see a way forward. I don't know where to go from here. All doors to movement seem to be shut, or when they seem open and I try to walk through them, they seem to shut in my face. Mm-hmm. And now I have a hypothesis. Is this the countertransference channel of communication? Is this the patient showing me in the only way they can, because they don't have words for it? It's not really conscious. They're showing me something about what it's like to live in their skin. Are they showing me something, right, without words, in the only way they can, of what their experience is? And it's vital. It's crucial. I have to be able to grasp that, not intellectually, but experientially. Right? I mean, in order to help the patient find a way out of this place that just feels, like just this dark, dark, hopeless well of imprisonment that they can't even describe in words. And if I'm going to help them find a way out of that or a way through it, I really have to be there with them. I really have to know that experience with them. I have to live that with them so that we can begin to find a way forward, starting from there, not starting from what I'm bringing as my agenda as the therapist, where I think I'm supposed to start. We need to meet the patient where the patient is.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That is always the starting point for the work. And that is where the patient is. And then we start to do something in therapy that the patient cannot do for themselves and nobody else has been able to do for them either. Otherwise, they wouldn't be where they are.
Right.
We start to give form and shape, which is to say, we start to give words to that experience, right? Right? We start to move it out of the realm of this dark, formless, shapeless, nameless void and bring it into the realm of something that we can think about and recognize, understand, right? We can start to map this territory in a way that it begins to become familiar, right? So maybe I'm going into giving more examples or going into more depth than you really wanted. But
No, it's great.
So
it's great.
important.
It's exactly what I was hoping you would talk more about, because that resonance. I mean, I kind of get this sense of like when you hear a stringed player and they're playing one string and the other string is like vibrating, in resonance with that other string. And that's kind of the sensation I have. What you're describing is like when we feel that. What did you call the second kind of countertransference when you're picking
complementary
up on
and
complementary?
concordant? Okay. And complementary is very common, especially today. And therapists enact it, live it out without insight or understanding or awareness, right? This has to do with the psychology of people who tend to enter the mental health professions now. Many patients come in and they are feeling, hurt and beaten down and very needy. And it's very easy for the therapist to then step into, the role of all good, all nurturing caretaker. And then the two of them, reenact this transference and countertransference pattern endlessly. And the patient usually likes the therapist and they feel good about the therapy, but they don't change. They get therapy and more therapy. But outside of them, the relationship with the therapist is close and warm and deep and supportive.
Yeah.
But their lives outside of therapy don't change. And if that's not happening, what in God's name are we doing there? The purpose of therapy is change.
Jonathan, I wish we could talk a whole nother hour. Is there any sort of final words that you would want to give our listeners? Anything that you want to make sure that all the therapists listening, all the clients listening, anyone else can take with them?
Psychotherapy is a meaningful, ongoing relationship. If you're being offered something other than that, you're not getting meaningful psychotherapy. And if we're dealing with entrenched, ingrained difficulties, that have developed over long periods of time, it's not going to magically change in 8 weeks or 12 weeks. It doesn't work that way. And somebody who's telling you that that's what you need may be selling snake oil.
Thank you. Where can our listeners find you? I'm aware that you have articles and you've got an assessment out there that listeners can access, and we'll be sure to drop those in the show notes. But can you share with us more about how folks can find you and the work that you're doing?
Well, sure. I have a website, and the website is my name, jonathanshedler.com. On my website, there's links to academic scientific papers, but there's also links to very accessible blogs and podcasts and pieces that I've read, that I've written, not just for other professionals, but for the public. So jonathanshedler.com writings. We'd have to devote an entire show to why and how this is relevant. But if you want a snapshot, sort of a diagnostic picture of your mental health, right? With respect not to the underlying unconscious patterns that you and I have been talking about today, but just a surface snapshot of how we're doing with respect to depression, anxiety, trauma, sleep disorders, substance use, and so on. I've been involved in developing a psychological test. It's called PsychScan. And the test has been around for quite a while, but the website making it publicly available is a work in progress. But right now we have a website called psych-scan.com. And if you go there, you can actually take a fully functional version of the test and get your reports. It's really designed for clinicians. So if you're a therapist and you might want to use this in your practice, go to psych-scan. But if you're a patient and you'd like some information, you can get that also.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much. You've been so generous with your time and bringing your heartful work to the world. We just really appreciate what you're doing and hope we can have you back sometime because I know there's so much more to dig into. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you for that. I'd love to come back another time. Thank you.
Great.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more about our guest and their work, check the show notes or visit us at narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. If you're a licensed mental health professional working with complex trauma, we're excited to share with you about our upcoming NARM therapist trainings. Level 2 training is a clinical training where you will get trained in a comprehensive developmental framework and clinical approach for resolving the long-term impacts of ACEs and CPTSD. You will receive individualized support from a team of skilled and supportive trainers led by NARM senior faculty Brad Kammer. Learn more about this training or reserve your spot by visiting www.narmtraining.com/schedule. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community, connection with you, and changing the world by transforming trauma.